Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everyone, welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. Today I'm here with Curt Schreiber. Curt is the Chief Creative Officer at VSA Partners. He does work with a lot of large-scale customers kind of all around the globe. Curt, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
Really excited to chat with you. Kind of just kicking it off. When we think about the type of customers that you work with, you tend to work with customers that operate at global scale. So really big companies that have these ideas of how do you bridge the gap around scale, around internationalization, around the idea of how you take a brand and you make it pervasive all around the globe. How do you think about that approach?
You know, we do a lot of work for a lot of large corporations. Most of them have global footprints. You know, oftentimes the initial thought on redoing a system, which is often the case, a lot of people oftentimes go right to like the cultural nuances, what color means in a country or what an image might mean. And those things are important. There are some real experts in those organizations that can help navigate those waters. But I've always felt like the greatest challenge in developing a global system is what you just said, designing at scale and thinking through like not just what's going to work for a user, but for hundreds of users. So you have to take into account a whole sort of set of methodologies and ideas and approaches in order to design in that way.
Yeah, I think that there was a somewhat famous conversation about IBM at one point. That was, IBM had this idea of it wanted to become a design-centric organization. And so they went and hired a bunch of people in design, not really thinking about what it would take to actually get those people to work together at scale. And the challenges that presented were really about this idea, not about how you think about the value of design in terms of hiring designers, but thinking about the value of design in terms of how do you scale a design practice. And I think that there's a lot of lesson there.
Yeah, for sure. That was Elliot Noyes who helped to establish that corporate program for IBM. And he was the one who brought in Paul Rand and Ray and Charles, Eames, and others alike. And I think Elliot said this, or someone on the team had said this, but they never really wanted to develop a house style, but rather be known for problems well solved. For a corporate program to kind of base itself in that kind of ideology, very progressive, especially at that time in the 60s.
What does a project like that signal inside of an organization? And maybe take this in a modern context, right? So today, when an organization embarks on this idea of like, how do I value design? How do I care about design? How do I show that value inside of the organization? Oftentimes that is using a design system. Those tend to be showpieces for an organization about this is our brand, this is our componentry, this is how we think about the user experience. What does that signal now in today's context?
Well, organizations will redo their design systems and sometimes it's just because they don't feel modern anymore. But really the most powerful thing a new design system can signal is a change in the organization. It's like something about the organization is becoming different. It's becoming something that can signal something about its future. So sometimes it means they're entering a new market or they're doing a whole portfolio remix. Sometimes there's a large merger or acquisition or spinoff, but there's a strategic business intent behind each one of those activities. And so the system itself wants to help support that change that is happening inside an organization.
So it's almost like the context of a rebrand, where when an organization wants to do some sort of refresh and signal this new purpose or new ideology, oftentimes you'll see a brand change. The refresh of the design system, is that kind of like the new rebrand?
Yeah, I think it is. In a lot of cases, it's very expensive to change an identity because of the countless applications that need to be turned over. And oftentimes, logos, I think, especially for large organizations, you don't want to change them that frequently. You want them to be in place. But yet the expression, the marketing, the communications, the design of software, interfaces, that needs to be updated for all kinds of reasons. But the brand expression, I think, is not only important that that gets refreshed more frequently than identity, but also that it's pulled throughout the whole organization in a very systemic way. And that makes it a very, very powerful tool and asset for an organization.
So when you think about that asset moniker that we attach to a system that helps you scale, if you're an executive and you're looking at like, how do I showcase this renewal purpose? How do I think about the strategic nature of what I'm doing with systems? The intention there seems to say like, hey, this is something that supports not just any one product, but the organization as a whole and really the reputation of the company.
Yeah. Well, what I hear a lot from clients is how excited they are. Their customers get excited and that drives sales or drives favorability. Business partners find it exciting as well. Employees find it really exciting. Kind of rejuvenates them and their purpose for like why they work for who they work for. Like I just said, like some clients will just say, hey, it's exciting. It actually kind of puts some energy into the organization, renewed enthusiasm and belief in who they work for or who they use for their purchasing of products and services. That has direct input on return on investment, reducing risk, and increasing reputation.
You use the reputation as the hook to basically say, hey, this is why this is important. This matters to this business because we're changing something. And that change is exciting. It garners support and interest. And that leads to a better ROI in the investment in these systems. When you're working with executives, like how do they think about that investment? Do they think about this as I'm spending money to go build a thing? Or is this like, hey, I'm spending money on this strategic initiative to go solve this problem?
I think the most powerful conversation you can have, a designer can have, is when you engage the CEO in that very conversation. Because when you sit down with them, they may not really fully realize the power or the importance of it.
I would say most don't.
You're right. Most don't. Those are strategic conversations. And so I feel like it's a designer's responsibility to understand the strategic direction of a corporation or the vision that a founder or a CEO has about the kind of organization, the kind of business that they want to create or they want to advance. And so when we approach our work, arguably, a lot of people will say, gosh, you're like strategic designers, is the way that some have described us, because we oftentimes, while we will follow our gut instinct, a lot of our solutions are firmly rooted and grounded in strategy. And when you do that, you're kind of starting to uncover or unpeel this idea that it's really about the why you're doing it, not what you're doing. When people begin to understand why it's being done, then it feels like it's grounded in real sensibility and purpose.
So when you're thinking about that strategic conversation around a design system, how do you approach that when you are being brought in to say, hey, you all need to think about this differently? What does that conversation look like?
Well, a lot of our brand systems and a lot of our design systems are always rooted in like this enduring idea. And so brand strategy typically is on the front end of brand expression or brand identity. But in brand strategy, I think the most powerful thing you can uncover is what is that enduring idea of the business? Like, what does that business fundamentally believe? And from that, all kinds of exploratories can be done. The design system supports the idea of the company, and the idea of the company is supported by the design system.
So in that way, we talked a lot about branding, right? And this like fundamental core idea to the brand. It sounds like that's almost too limiting, that there's actually a lot more to it than just the brand. And by the way, I love the association with brand. Our most successful customers at Knapsack are the ones that really deeply associate their brand with their design system. But I think that there's more to it.
Well, great design systems are inspired by an enduring idea, but then they're also grounded or guided by principles. And when the principles are really well articulated, it can have a profound effect on many things like the product design, the user interfaces, the service design, the retail experiences, and everything else. So, a very simple principle that everyone can relate to is something like less is more. That's an easy one that everyone gets. But if you can begin to unpack these for an organization, it can guide you in almost unlimited ways. And the brand system will be one of them. But all parts of the organization can benefit. There's this thought that, in working with IBM over the years, John Iwata had introduced this tool. It goes something like this, if you draw a box and draw a line to each corner, and you thought about the spectrum, the scale, and it said, looks like, sounds like, thinks like, behaves like. When you start to look at the design, marketing, comms part of an organization, we can be really influential in what something looks like or how something sounds. But when you go into other parts of the organization, research and development, sales, manufacturing, et cetera, thinks like and behaves like become really important parts of that system. So design systems, design principles are not limited just to branding. They can really successfully impact all parts of an organization if you think of it in those broad terms.
How do you go about constructing those principles? Because, like you said, everybody gets less is more, but also probably not the world's greatest design system principle, given that it can kind of be applied anywhere. When you think about the creation of that, how do you create something that your organization fits within, but is still rigid enough to represent like a true guideline?
Well, I think of design principles sometimes as, I wouldn't think about them as like guardrails as much as I would like, this allows you to pursue certain paths. It's interesting doing some work with Converse over the years. There were some really important underlying design principles. A lot of had to do with creativity. We probably worked together for almost a decade, and we never had a brand guideline. All we had was really this idea of the freedom of expression and embrace art, embrace music, embrace fashion, and embrace sport. That was one of our big foundational principles. And then the reason why it worked is because it was authentic to who they were. When you look back at their past or history, those are all things that they supported. And that's where the brand had shown up with the Ramones or with, artists, etc. You can pull forward what's relevant, but you have to also consider what's meaningful today, what resonates with consumers today. And so that's an example of a principle that we found to be very effective, especially for Converse.
Well, what I love about everything you talked about there is those also work globally, right? Like when you think about the global brand of Converse, that has a global appeal. Everybody understands those things that you talked about. And so when you think about a system for Converse and the like, when you take those principles and you apply them to a global system, what form does that usually take? Is that like, here's one design system, and this is how we think about our brand expression and how we think about our service design and how we think about our retail design? Or is this something that represents like a structure or a way of thinking in the organization? And the reason why I ask this is the most mature teams that I've ever seen, they don't name their design system. They don't talk about their design system as its own thing. They think about it kind of as like a way of working or a way of being. And it's very like, Buddhist in its nature, right? This collective idea of like, oh no, this is just the way we build product. But I'm kind of curious, when you're trying to jump into that application globally, do you look at it as the end state as like design system nirvana, where this is just the way of working? Or do you tend to think about it as a product because that's something that's much more concrete and comprehensive?
I think it's highly dependent on the brand or on the organization. For some organizations, I'd say yes. I mean, it should be a thing because the institution itself is more accepting or more willing to operate in that way. So you do want it to be a thing that gets socialized, that gets embraced, that gets used, that gets referred to. But other organizations like Converse, and I would argue there's many, many more like that, they want to be really driven kind of by an ethos. Creating a boundary around the brand is not something that the brand itself wants. It's also not something their customers or their consumers want either. They don't want to be defined by one particular thing. They want to be defined by an idea. And so, coming back to what I said before, I think it's organization or brand dependent on which approach is the right approach. We do both. And we have done some in-betweens as well that, some organizations want more flexible systems on one end of the scale. And then on the other end of the scale, they want something that's more formal. Being able to dial up and dial down a system is also sort of the thing that lives in between.
That's interesting when you talk about it that way, because I think that there's lots of those continuums that exist inside of these systems, right? The idea of centralized and decentralized, the idea of comprehensive and consumable, the idea of consistency and composability. The structure of these systems tend to be really fluid. And so when you think about, again, getting back to those principles, that feels like a strong guiding definition of how you want to start to think about these various continuums that you operate within. And so when you all are looking at a big global project for a big global brand, what is the approach that you take to some of these systematic decisions? Is it about uncovering the soul of that organization? Is it grounded in those principles? How do you go and say, like, we want to have like some global, highly decentralized, highly modular system versus we want to have something that's like tightly controlled, regional, and rigid?
Right, right. I think it's kind of like threefold. Number one, I think you look at the existing system and what's working and what's not. Most of what we do as designers are iterations of something that exists today. And so it's important to look at and understand what's working and what's not working. Number two, I think you have to look at the audiences. And you have to think about the audiences in a really, really broad way. You can't have, Milton's view of the shareholder as the most important and companies' missions are to maximize profits. You also can't have just an IDEO version and say, no, this is all about the user, right? We're going to be very user-centric. But in today's design systems, branding systems need to take into account all users, all audiences, all constituents, all stakeholders. So the employee, the business partner, the community, of course, the investor, and of course, the consumer, NGOs. There's something that we like to talk about sometimes, which is like multi-stakeholder design. And multi-stakeholder design looks at the needs of those stakeholders in aggregate. I would say that's the second most important thing to do when you're trying to decide whether your system should be flexible or whether it should be rigid. And then ultimately, I think the third one is, we've been using this term reputation, and I like the term reputation. It's an important one that everyone can relate to. But in some of our work, we think about character because reputation is something that people try and manage. It's difficult to manage reputation. It's much easier to manage your character because your character is dependent on what you do. It's not necessarily the way that people perceive you, which is what a reputation is. So the third thing that we think a lot about is character. If the design system is expressive or it's rigid or it's somewhere in between, it's like, does that reflect who you are? Does it reflect your character?
I love that. It's interesting, right? I think that the only reason why reputation is the word that everyone uses, and there's some intention behind it, but it has nice alliteration in an MBA textbook. And I have a hard time suppressing my MBA training all the time in these conversations. It's like, you think about ROI, risk, reputation, the 3 R's or whatever.
Right.
Everybody tries to make those sorts of frameworks exist because they're memorable, like the 4 P's or however many P's there are. But I think that like the idea of character is interesting because reputation is external versus character being something that's internal. When you think about that idea about like how does the design system reflect that character, I think we've had a good conversation about how the principles kind of define the baseline for that. But when you think about how many people these systems touch, that multi-stakeholder design, so some of our systems in particular, they support thousands of users. And when you think about those thousands of users, how do you think about really reaching them with this character, right? Like how does that character expression carry into the work of some designer in a country that is far outside of the original scope of who this was maybe made for?
Yeah. Well, it kind of comes back to some of the things that we touched upon early on, but these design systems have become largely decentralized in terms of how they're managed and how they're experienced in the users. And so, there was a time in which a very small part of the organization would have their hands on the design steering wheel. That's not the case anymore. It's hundreds or thousands internally and externally. Think about social media now. Even your consumers or your clients, your customers also have control. What I've come to appreciate is that a lot of design systems and brand systems, there's all the do's and don'ts. There's guidelines you have to follow and et cetera, et cetera. That's the what. That's the what is the system? How should you use it? the lines in which you can color within, etc. But a lot of what people don't understand is the why. Why is a system designed the way it is? And once people come to appreciate that, then they can operate more freely if they keep that in mind, which is why training and governance and all those other things are really important. And when I mean training, it's not like classroom training. It's just like helping people understand the craft, the importance, the strategic underpinning, that kind of training. And governance isn't so much, it's not like the design police or the brand police. I think of these as like two-way conversations, and they're opportunities to learn. I like to assemble a cross-agency, cross-company team that works with other teams around the world. And some of it's presenting work back and forth to each other. But oftentimes, I think the most powerful thing you can do is co-create with somebody. The act of co-creation builds this really strong bond, but there's some really like powerful interactive learning moments that person keeps with them forever. These can go on for months, or sometimes these can go on for years. But that kind of co-creation is a very, very powerful learning tool that I think is one that you want to deploy if you're doing tasks such as these.
I agree. The richness of that co-creation is a really powerful driver for adoption, for success, for training and understanding about how these systems work. I also think that the stories around that co-creation are really powerful and the outcomes from that co-creation. And so when you think about that, one of the things that I've always despised, guarded against, etc., when building these design systems is the idea that these need to be locked down. They need to be really controlled and held very tightly because there's some, unique intellectual property or some power in them that we shouldn't share with the world. But I think that those barriers oftentimes slow us down. When you think about your ideal design system, like how do you see it?
Well, the ideal system, I think the ideal modern system really is designed for the user, has the user in mind. It's both comprehensive, where you can provide a lot of information and detail, but it's also really consumable. And here's what I mean by that. If we unpack those ideas, I had mentioned a few minutes ago, making it two-way. A system needs to support a conversation, right? From the expert to the user, from the user to the expert, and from user to user. And so when a system does that, it can be very, very effective. The second one is that I'm a big fan now of opening these systems up, like making them available to the world. It's like you want access. You want people to use the system. And that's what I mean by consumable, right? You can't consume something that you can't find. And when you have like design systems that are behind firewalls and locked up in binders or in PDFs that people send to each other, it's like it doesn't get used. It's got to be open. The confidentiality of it is sort of works against you in the adoption of it. And so opening it up is like a really, really big idea. And everyone should be doing that.
When you think about that opening up, is that opening up the design? Is that opening up the code? Is that opening up the principles? Like, what are you showing when you open it up?
All of it. When you do that, I think it speaks to the intellectual qualities of an organization, like real thought, real purpose behind this. And those corporations are essentially more progressive. I mean, when it comes to code, a lot of progressive companies are making their code more available. Again, it's all about adoption, right? So if you want the system to be used, you have to provide the system and the elements of the system, the logic of the system in a particular kind of way where it can be consumed.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of organizations think about how do they control this, right? And, there's this idea that, especially as it relates to brand, like brand adherence and this idea of sameness is paramount. And anything less than the projection of that perfection out into the ecosystem is somehow a failing of that organization. And it's crazy the number of times that like very, very expensive, very famous, reputable law firms are involved in the conversation around whether or not we are able to host a site that showcases an organization's brand assets. And that kind of blows my mind because there is a part of this that is about that control. But without that ability to show the world what you're trying to do, it feels like you're hamstringing your own reach.
Yeah. There's an IP-ness to it for sure that people want to keep held closely to the organization. But I don't know. I just don't have that view of it. I mean, there's definite IP that you want to own. There's things that should exist behind firewalls, with an organization because it gives them competitive advantage in the marketplace. But again, it's all about adoption. You want people to have easy access to it. So I say open it up.
It's interesting. We were having a conversation with our friend Robin at JP Morgan Chase, and Robin's the creator of the SALT design system. And the SALT design system is really highly composable. And one of the things that he said is like, there was some concern within the organization about the idea of like, well, what if somebody were to take this and make it Barbie? Like, what does JP Morgan on Barbie look like?
Yeah.
And what's funny is like we did that, right? It's kind of like a funny prank for him is we Barbie-fied the SALT design system. But in being able to do that, we were able to understand how the SALT design system functioned and its inner workings and how the application of a theme like that, which like would never actually go into production anywhere, is kind of a fun take on the way of managing and controlling a brand. In full disclosure, like Robin's not using any of that work, but the idea that like, hey, we want to go publish this thing as a way of showcasing the work that we're doing, there's so much power in that. Even if it ends up being barbified somewhere, the risk of that is absolutely worth the value of just that gain and understanding of how that system functions.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of learning and introducing things into a system that you may not normally introduce to learn what the outcome would be. That's what's so much fun about AI and generative AI and so forth is the kinds of combinations and things that can come out of it. That sounds like I would love to see that a Barbified version. But you know what, Chris? It's like these big global design systems too. They take time to build, and I think what's so interesting about what you're saying right now is watching a system evolve. So many corporations, they'll take 6 months or a year, they'll put a system in place and they won't touch it for 5 or 10 years and they'll come back to it and say, okay, this thing needs to be redone.
The 6-year cycle of every digital transformation project you've ever been a part of.
That's right. Exactly. And it's not the way. I mean, to be most effective, they need to be living systems. They need to be constantly evolving. We were talking about IBM a little while ago. I think the IBM system, which is an amazing system, it's been evolving for some time now. It's like 8 or 9 years in the making. It's really pretty phenomenal. Nike does that as well and other businesses. But it's like you constantly want to be adding to, replacing, and taking away within the system, managing the system. You just can't like put it on a shelf and expect it to be relevant and timeless and say, that's the system. But today's modern companies are always pushing for new iteration. And it may not be Barbie, but again, it's like introducing these new things to the system constantly helps for it to stay fresh and not sort of fall into that camp of waking up one day and sort of saying to yourself, we need a new thing. I think it's healthier for an organization. I mean, that's what organizations are like. Imagine an organization like that put something in place and then decided 6 years or 10 years later to go ahead and like redo it. You have to constantly be challenging it and tinkering with it. And like I said, adding to it.
There's this pervasive idea that we've had for years where there was this idea of it's time to refresh our brand or it's time to refresh our design. And that would go on some multi-year cycle. And there were always these big bang releases where everyone would be like, okay, get ready for the rebrand. And then that rebrand would drop and everybody would have to do whatever they needed to do within their individual parts of the product organizations to go implement that rebrand. And that is a horrendously painful effort. And it also almost never goes according to plan, where you'll have a brand rollout that takes probably months in the ideal circumstance, probably more like years to actually get your different products in all the different vast corners of your ecosystem to actually adopt that new brand. But with these central systems, a lot of that control and a lot of that capability is about the ability to evolve it and not just say like, we're going to take one brand and discontinue it one day. And then the next day we're going to have a different brand.
Even like in the automotive industry, I guess, thinking about that a little bit right now, it's like, You will have times when you have to like totally revamp the entire vehicle. But the automotive company, I think, does a great job of this. Like year over year over year, they're constantly bringing new features and functionality and to the vehicles, make little design modifications or new color choices. That's really how brands need to be managed and built, maybe versus how a lot of them are done today.
What makes sense about AI in these systems to you?
Well, AI is making its debut. I mean, it's been around for a while. It's been around for like 30 years. And actually, AI has been all around us. But suddenly this year, with a lot of the attention, a lot of it was opened up to all types of users and new audiences. And it was made available for everyone to access the various, AI platforms. But I think right now it's like we're using it. We've adopted our own principles as an organization. Obviously, when we use it, we let people know we're using it. We're following all the proper guidance and guidelines and so forth. And a lot of those are changing like by the month. But we use AI to build narratives, explore taglines, create image libraries. So there's that part. But right now, it just feels like all we're using AI for primarily is we're like building assets that might live within the system. And I think that's sort of phase one. And that's perfectly fine. I think that at the moment, it's a lot about curation, right? You can use AI to create a lot of stuff, but a lot of it's not that great still. So a lot of it hits the floor. But from a designer standpoint, it's like kind of you're using AI to help create and ideate. And then as a designer, you're still curating that material. But what has yet to be explored, I think, where I would find it really interesting is how AI can actually help manage the system itself. I'm not a technologist, so I don't even know how you would begin to do that. But because good AI requires an abundance of data to draw upon and to learn from, I think it will be the big global design systems, the larger corporations that have the abundance of systems, of users, of applications, et cetera, of learnings that you'll be able to really fully take advantage of it and perhaps begin to actually help manage the design system, not just contribute to it.
Yeah, there's this interesting persona there because I tend to view AI as like this multi-persona idea, right? And like, look, love or hate personas. One of the things that's interesting about it is like it's not just one AI, right? There's an AI that's kind of like a librarian that helps you find things. There's an AI that's kind of like a creative that's, looking over your shoulder, helping you contribute to things. There's another one I think that's a manager, right? And that manager is looking at how the system is used and making recommendations for how you change the actual system itself. And I love that idea of, look, most of the systems that you see today are some organic hodgepodge, right? One product team cared enough to actually create a system. So happens that serendipitously, another product team in another part of the organization cared enough to create a system. And eventually those systems collide. And in almost every enterprise of some significant scale, there's multiple design systems that exist, none of which ever really necessarily had the intention of being like the design or brand system for that global organization. And more, we're seeing these companies kind of from the top down say, like, no, forget all that. We can't have 7 different systems. We need to have one system. And there needs to be some way of managing that so it still appeals at the product level, but is ultimately centrally controlled. And I think that the way we're building these systems now, we're having all these conversations about systems of systems and complex inheritance. We're probably building them wrong, just most likely, because nobody's built stuff like this before at this kind of scale. And so what I think is a really interesting application of AI in this case is like, as we see these systems come online, of which there are very, very few right now, we should be able to start to see how we can actually build more efficiency and more capability into the way these serve people based upon just looking at how folks use them. And there's a really cool AI enabled future that says, hey, this complex system of inheritance that you kind of conceived of that's really heady and kind of difficult for everybody to understand, here's a better way. And don't worry about the headiness. Just present to the user what they need to get their work done. And that to me is a really cool idea of an application of AI in these systems.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. There's a lot of potential here. And it's going to be really interesting to see how not just our industry, but how all industries come to adopt it. Right now, though, I just feel like there's a tremendous amount of hype around it, obviously. there's also like this sense that, machines are going to take over the world and they're going to kill humans and stuff. When AI starts creating its own content based on either misinformation or intentional destructive ideas, that it'll begin to create content faster than even humans can be able to create content or be able to monitor or control the creation of that content. So yeah, some feel like it's going to become a big swamp of like nothing. So we'll see where it all goes. But I do think that if I had my wish for AI and these design systems, it would be to use AI as a way to have your system better perform. So when you look at it through utility and through performance as a designer, it's not enough that it looks good, but it also works. And the better it works, the better of a design it is. And so if AI could help with the performance of a system, then I think it could do some really powerful things.
Well, awesome. Hey, Curt, I want to thank you so much for being on. It's been a great conversation, super insightful. Love to get your take on all this stuff, especially understanding the scale at which you and your organization operates. It's been great to get an understanding and insight from you.
Well, thanks, Chris. I've had a good time.
Hey, everyone. This has been the Design System Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Have a great day, everybody. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.